The Best Way to Explain It, Episode 17. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, podcast listeners, to another episode of The Best Way to Explain It, the podcast that's like a box of chocolates. Horrible for diabetics.
Hey, callbacks to an earlier episode.
Second diabetic reference
Yay.
In my opening little glib remark.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for looking out for me as I
Yeah.
have chocolates sitting on my desk right in front of me.
That's
tempting
amazing.
Me. Yeah.
So when I'm talking about really boring legislation, you can just be enjoying a nice chocolate bar.
Yeah, I eat liver with a side of fava beans and a nice Chianti, and then for dessert I have like a little mini Mr. Good bar from Halloween.
Okay, I feel like you're quoting something.
I'm gonna let you try and figure it out. Do you know what it's from?
Not a clue.
It's The Silence of the Lambs, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I paraphrased it though, because Hannibal is actually talking about like eating a dude's liver. But yeah.
But you don't do that.
I do not cannibalize at this point in my life.
I'm relieved to hear that.
Yeah. We are an anti-cannibalism podcast.
Yes.
For now.
Unless it's voluntary.
Unless it's
in which
voluntary.
case, it's weird, but
yeah,
I guess you do you.
I don't know. I still feel slightly morally opposed, but I'm not going to like force you to not eat someone who's okay with you eating them.
Right. I mean voluntary from the person being eaten. Like, I assume the other part is voluntary.
Yeah.
So, just to clarify.
Well, there's multiple stories in the Bible about like cannibalism, aren't there? I like ancient history.
I know there's like child sacrifice, or
Yeah.
like some of the people that surrounded the Israelites were all into child sacrifice.
Yeah, I was listening to Dan Carlin talk about like multiple times within the like Spartans and like that whole 300 movie and the actual history behind it, and he was talking about how they would like feed kings their like sons, their first son or something as punishment.
That's really messed up.
It's a really funny prank. We should try it sometime.
You just ate your son. It's a prank. Gosh.
Jeez, why are you so worked up? It's just your first son.
It was in jest.
Okay. Dear. Well, we definitely took that in a way different direction than you're going to take it.
Speaking of cannibalism.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is actually, well, first of all, before we get started, again, the giveaway is still going on. You guys are probably sick of us talking about it. Well, if you're sick about us talking about it, maybe leave a review, and, well, it's still going to last the same amount of time, but you'll feel better knowing, hey, I entered the giveaway. I know what these guys are talking about. So how you do that is you leave a rating and review on iTunes of us, even if you don't listen on iTunes, leave it on iTunes, and then you need to screenshot that rating and review and send it to me at scott@thebestwaytoexplainit.com. And if you do that, you will be entered in a drawing to win a free Amazon Echo. You don't even have to pay shipping. So I'm taking that out of my own pocket to send it to you. So,
and inherently out of my own pocket too.
Basically, yep.
Wow.
Uh-huh. Speaking of, you still didn't pay me for that, buddy.
Yeah, why did I agree to this?
I don't know. All right. With that out of the way and the cannibalism topic tabled for another day.
Yep.
We actually got this as a request, this topic, and if you have looked at the title of this episode, you probably already know what it is, because it's very controversial nowadays. And so essentially I got a request from my brother actually to explain this topic. It's net neutrality. So what is going on? He says that he sees it all the time, and he wants to know whether or not he should be upset about it, what the situation is, and so I was like, what better time than just before the vote, which I believe is going to be on the 14th, barring something changing. December 14th, 2017, for those that are listening to a back episode. And yeah, so this is kind of our first foray into the more politically based topics, so there's good odds that half of you are going to completely hate our guts by the end of the episode, and the other half are going to be fist pumping and, really, really liking us by the end of it.
With some of our beliefs, maybe everyone will just
There's a
hate
good
us.
chance.
Yeah.
Right.
That's all right.
Yeah, so, but I do want to emphasize I'm going to be as fair as possible in this episode. And so in order to do that, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to split this episode up into 2 parts. And so the first part of the episode is just going to be me explaining what net neutrality actually is and kind of what the debate's over and what the regulations that are in question. I'm going to give like a full kind of history of the regulations that are relevant to the discussion so we can really get a full-fledged view of the situation. And then after that part is done, then I'm going to give my thoughts on the whole situation and what I think you ought to think about it. And that way, if you don't really care what I think, then you don't have to listen to me about it, and you'll be able to come away with a more comprehensive understanding of the issue without any of the vitriol and, all of that nastiness that we see on Twitter every day.
You've been using the word vitriol a lot lately, and by
it's a great word.
I mean, you used it once in a text to me, and then now you just used it. I love it.
Well, that's the word around this topic. So
yeah.
So that's kind of how it's going to go, and I will explicitly say when I'm transitioning into some more biased commentary from me about the whole issue. So yeah, with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to clear up is the difference between net neutrality as a concept and then net neutrality in the regulatory nature that we're kind of seeing today. So the concept of net neutrality has actually been around for quite a while, whereas like the pieces of regulation that are under consideration by the current FCC administration have really only been around since 2015. Well, they've been around since 2010, but 2015 was really when they became enforced. Net neutrality as a concept refers to the idea that the internet ought to be a place where all content should be treated equally with no regard for differences in speed, content, or the applications being used. So essentially all information needs to be treated by ISPs as the very same. So a net neutral internet, according to the way the term is typically defined, is one where ISPs could not restrict access to certain websites or give priority speed to people who pay more or not allow certain applications to use their infrastructure to communicate. So that's what the net neutral internet would be according to the concept. And this concept was first given its name by a guy named Tim Wu, W-U, in his paper Network Neutrality, Broadband Discrimination. So I'm going to link to that paper in the show notes if you really want to read it. And I did not, but, it's there for you. So I think he wrote the paper in 2003, but the ideas behind net neutrality started earlier. He was the one who gave those ideas their name. So now that we kind of understand what net neutrality as a basic concept is, then we'll do a kind of a deeper dive into what net neutrality is in terms of the regulations and the legal implications of the concept. So the real legal battle didn't really start in 2015, although that's commonly where you might hear it, but it actually started all the way back in 1934 with the Communications Act of 1934, which was instituted under the FDR administration, and as a result, this Communications Act formed the FCC. So prior to this legislation, there was actually an agency called the Federal Radio Communication Commission, which was dissolved and had its powers transferred and expanded, and that became the FCC. So not only that, but the Communications Act classified telephone companies, so the people that run the phone systems, they classified them as being quote-unquote common carriers as opposed to information providers. So this is an important concept, this reclassification of the telephone companies. So this reclassification is found under a clause of the Communications Act called Title II. So if you see people talking about Title II, that's what they're referring to, this kind of reclassification idea of the, I guess in this instance, the internet service providers as common carriers as opposed to information providers. So That's the Title II thing.
Yeah. So another thing with common carriers is a lot of people bring up the idea of a natural monopoly, which means it's kind of like the electric grid, and trying to stay politically neutral.
Hey, I'm going to actually talk all about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Oh, yeah. Dude.
Sorry, I must have missed that part when I was reading over it.
Well,
cool.
but that is a good point. That is a good
Yeah.
point. That's a very relevant idea to this concept. So this Title II this Title II stuff or whatever, I was going to call it nonsense, but it's not really nonsense. It matters because the government has this idea that certain services are better classified as quote-unquote public utilities, and I think this is what you were kind of getting at.
Yeah.
So basically what this means is that everyone ought to have equal access to public utilities, and thus the government has the power to regulate these public utilities in order to better accomplish this. So as a common carrier, the telephone companies are only allowed to offer their services to the general public if they're licensed to do so by a government regulatory agency, which is, the FCC in this instance. So that's what we mean by a public utility or the common carrier. So an important thing to note about this act, the Communications Act, is that in its first section where it states, so for the purpose of regulating interstate and foreign commerce in communication by wire and radio, so as to make available, so far as possible, to all the people of the United States, a rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide wire and radio communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges for the purpose of the national defense and for the purpose of securing a more effective execution of this policy by centralizing authority, therefore granted by law, to several agencies, and by granting additional authority with respect to interstate and foreign commerce in wire and radio communication, there is hereby created a commission to be known as the Federal Communications Commission, which shall be constituted as hereinafter provided, and which shall execute and enforce the provisions of this act. So that's the first section of the Communications Act. So this section, what it actually does is it allows the FCC to enforce future regulations on technologies that didn't exist at the time of the Act's passing. So obviously this would mean technologies like the internet, because that's communication by wire and radio as well, the wireless. So that's where the FCC kind of says it derives its power from this section.
Okay.
So now that we have telephone companies as common carriers regulated by the FCC, that's kind of a big step. But clearly, the internet wasn't a thing in 1934, but in 1996 it definitely was a thing. So, of course, you know this if you listen to thebestwaytoexplainit.com/5, which was my first episode in the series on the internet. Oh, yeah, by the way, I'm sorry I'm talking about the internet again. I just can't get away from it. I can't get away from it. I swear next time it's not going to be about the internet.
It was a suggestion, so you just latched onto it naturally.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And it was timely. So, okay. So, you guys know all about the history of the internet. Go to episode 5 if you want to learn about it. So, as the Communications Act allowed, the internet would seemingly be under the umbrella of the FCC's authority, right? Well, in 1996, the Telecommunications Act was passed by the Clinton administration, which specifically exempted the internet from the Communications Act. So, under the Communications Act, the internet would have been regulated by the FCC, but the Telecommunications Act of 1996 exempted it. So this stated that the internet service providers were not common carriers, but rather they were what was called information services. So this meant that they did not need a license from the FCC to provide their services. So the point of the Telecommunications Act, or at least its stated purpose, was to deregulate and remove barriers to entry to the market. So it was kind of like a check of power on the FCC.
Yeah.
So that was 1996. So we had the 1934 was the Communications Act passed by FDR, or the FDR administration. Telecommunications Act in 1996, which was the Clinton administration's kind of piece of legislation. So first, the Communications Act, just to recap what we've covered so far, is So Communications Act, internet service providers would have been able to be regulated by the FCC as common carriers. In the Telecommunications Act of 1996, they're not able to be because they are, or at least no more than any other business can by the government.
Okay.
So that's kind of where we're at. So the main thing that the Telecommunications Act did was it rewrote a lot of the Title II section of the Communications Act of 1934, and the hope behind this rewrite was that it would make the licensure process a little bit less burdensome. And not only that, but from what I understand, this act actually repealed the 1982 AT&T consent decree, which was basically an antitrust suit against AT&T that broke them up into a bunch of different companies. So it repealed that. And then the oh my gosh, I cannot say that. The Telecommunications Act also prevents the acquisition by telephone companies of more than a 10% interest in cable operators and vice versa, as well as it is preventing joint ventures between phone and cable companies in the same area, though exceptions can be made, particularly in rural areas where there, by nature, just aren't a lot of options. So that's kind of what the Telecommunications Act did. So that was in 1996. So in 2010, the FCC decided it was going to try and regulate cable and phone companies anyways. Now, they did this in the FCC Open Internet Order of 2010. So basically what this regulation did was it banned cable TV and phone providers from preventing access to competitors or certain websites like Netflix, that'd be internet access. So there were three main points of emphasis in this regulation. So the first one being transparency. So this, what the Act specifically says is that fixed and mobile broadband providers must disclose the network management practices, performance characteristics, and terms and conditions of their broadband services. The second main point was no blocking. So that meant that fixed broadband providers may not block lawful content, application services, or non-harmful devices. Mobile broadband providers may not block lawful websites or block applications that compete with their voice or video telephony services. And then 3, no unreasonable discrimination. So the Act says that fixed broadband providers may not unreasonably discriminate in transmitting lawful network traffic. These regulations also allow for what was called a quote-unquote reasonable network management. So that was just to allow the ISPs to still be able to, sort of manage their own networks, but they had to abide by those 3 points. And so you'll notice that the regulations don't apply as strictly to mobile networks because the regulation actually states that in light of these considerations, we conclude it is appropriate to take measured steps at this time to protect the openness of the internet when accessed through mobile broadband. So the reasoning for this is that mobile networks have more competition and thus are more likely to, be this standard of net neutrality. And also they talk about how the mobile broadband market is still in its early stage, and so they want to see what sorts of things go on in the market before they proceed with stricter regulations. And this mobile stuff, if you want to read it, is actually found on page 52 of the Open Internet Order of 2010. So I read it. You're welcome. But if you really want to, I'm going to be linking to most of these. I'll link to all of the pieces of legislation if you really want to, take the time to read 2,000 pages of regulation.
Sounds
I don't.
like a joyous afternoon to me.
Yeah, but if you want, you can check that. That way you can fact check what I'm saying. So it's also important to note that these regulations did allow ISPs to charge more for faster internet access. So the proponents of net neutrality didn't like that fact. And so those are some of the regulations that are kind of up for debate today, those 3 main points. Well, the first one's not really up for debate, the transparency. That's pretty standard. So the issue now is that these regulations actually took a hit when in January 14th, 2014, the D.C. Circuit Court heard the case Verizon versus the FCC, and essentially their ruling was that as long as the ISPs were not classified as common carriers, the FCC had no authority to enforce their regulations. And so then there was this debate that broke out between those, such as the FCC commissioner at the time, Tom Wheeler, who believed that in Section 706 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the FCC was given the authority to regulate ISPs, whereas people like President Obama thought it would be good if ISPs were just reclassified as common carriers under Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. So usually we'll see this split as being between the ISPs and the FCC opposing the reclassification, and then the net neutrality advocates supporting the reclassification. So does that kind of make sense?
Okay.
Does that make sense,
Yeah.
like the distinction? So the reason I think that was the case, because I thought it was a little weird that the FCC wouldn't want to reclassify, but I think what they want to be able to regulate things that aren't necessarily common carriers as well, and so it's kind of a power grab sort of thing. And like, I'm not trying to impose political commentary on it. That seems to make the most sense to me.
It seems odd that they're opposing that reclassification.
If it would give them more power over it.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm thinking maybe they were counting on like a different classification, not necessarily a reclassification to a common carrier, but a different like Communications Act or something.
The way I understood it, or the way I think it probably, the reasoning I think behind Tom Wheeler, who was the commissioner that Obama nominated. So I thought that was kind of interesting that the commissioner Obama nominated had a different opinion from Obama.
Yeah.
But I think what he wanted was the Telecommunications Act to give the FCC more authority than, say somebody like Obama thought it did.
Yeah. So basically Tom Wheeler wanted it to say, you already have that power. We don't have to go to court for it. But then Obama said, let's reclassify them as common carriers.
Just to be safe, right?
Yeah, just to be safe. So that that would protect them against lawsuits, but it wouldn't give the FCC as much power, right?
Right. So I thought that was interesting that both ISPs and the FCC opposed it, but obviously the ISPs probably opposed it to prevent them from being regulated as common carriers. But the FCC probably opposed it because they thought they already had the power to do it. So, okay, hopefully that makes sense. So that was January 14th of 2014, and then on April 23rd of not 2104, like I have in my notes, it's actually 2014, so that same year, the FCC created a new rule that allowed ISPs the ability to have what's called a fast lane. So this is where content providers such as Netflix or Google, they could pay the ISPs a fee and in return have faster connection speeds that they could then offer to their customers. So they did this in such a way as to comply with the court rulings up until that point. So the net neutrality people didn't like that the FCC was allowing this to happen because the concern was that these new rules would allow the ISPs to, for a fee, make it easier to access certain content and harder to access other content. So in response to this, a bunch of companies that included companies like Google, Microsoft, eBay, and Facebook all signed a letter that illustrated their disagreement with this policy. But on May 15th, 2014, the rules actually passed that allowed for this fast lane rule to be allowed. So you could do this fast lane thing as an ISP. So that's kind of that next part of the debate. So on the same day, though, as that May that the fast lane rules passed, the FCC released a statement that it was considering two options, either permitting these fast lanes to be a thing or reclassifying the ISPs as being telecommunication services rather than information services. And so since being a telecommunication service is considered a common carrier under the Communications Act, this would then make them common carriers since, that's how they... Because remember, the Communications Act was for phone companies, right?
Yeah.
And so if internet companies are the same as phone companies, then they would also be common carriers.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the debate. And so if that was the case, they'd be able to regulate them under Title II of the Communications Act. And then, naturally, most online companies such as like Netflix, Reddit, Twitter, they were not fans of this fast lane concept, so they participated in what was called the quote-unquote internet slowdown, where they purposefully slowed down their services to demonstrate the horrific consequences of allowing the fast lane concept to exist. And that was on September 10th, 2014. I don't remember that. Do you?
I remember there being a big hullabaloo about it, but
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't like it didn't affect me. I was too busy doing stuff for school,
Being a winner.
Being a winner, yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever. I guess I would have been in college at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would have. Yeah. Same. Actually. Yeah. I don't remember that, but that was a thing. And then so that was September 10th, and then on November 10th, 2014, Obama then recommended the reclassification of the ISPs into common carriers or telecommunication services, which by extent would be common carriers.
That's really
And
interesting.
so, yeah. So finally, on January 16th, 2015, the Republicans in Congress brought forth legislation that allowed for the net neutrality regulation with some concessions, with one of those being the prohibition of the FCC of enacting further regulation on the ISPs. And then on February 26, 2015, the FCC officially reclassified ISPs as common carriers. So that's kind of where we are today in terms of the relevant regulation. So do you have any questions about what the regulation was or is at this point?
Not really. I'm just confused as to. I mean, the ISPs are very strongly opposed to it from how it reads, right? Because they would oppose regulation.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I've understood
it. But then all of these online companies, all of these large online companies are for it.
Yeah,
which I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and I'll get into why I think that is.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do just a kind of a so that's the regulation. But what we have now is a guy named Ajit Varadaraj Pai. That's the newly installed FCC chairman that Trump put in, and he wants to overturn the aforementioned regulations and instead have the ISPs voluntarily commit to the principles of net neutrality. And if they're not transparent about what they're doing, then use the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission, to crack down on the abusers. So the FTC, they're in charge of regulating interstate commerce. So that would be, since the internet obviously goes across state lines, that's where they would get that power from.
Interesting.
So this overturning of these regulations is done in the Restoring Internet Freedom Act, which I'm going to link again for you guys in the show notes if you really have the desire to read 400 pages of regulation. So for your information, I did not have that desire, but I did read the summary that they put at the front of the regulation. So
the abstract.
Now, yeah. So now we have and everything I've read about it, I verified within the regulation. I just didn't want to read the whole thing.
I feel you.
So that's kind of the basic timeline of what's been going on. So kind of in summary, what we just talked about are ISPs are currently common carriers, which means they are they can be and are regulated by the FCC as a public good or public utility. So we have net neutrality regulations in place as of 2015. So these regulations include, one, the transparency of ISPs in what they do with your data. So this one, I think Pi is in favor of keeping. So he's okay with the transparency. Basically, if they were to do, so if Pi got his way, if ISPs were to do any of the blocking, throttling, or whatever, they would just have to be upfront about it. And then the second regulation is no blocking. ISPs can't prevent you from accessing certain websites. Then the third one is no unreasonable discrimination. So this means that ISPs can't discriminate in their transmission of lawful traffic, so they have to treat all traffic the same. And then the fourth one, no fast lanes. So I'm not 100% sure if this one is still a thing, but I think as of now they can't negotiate fast lanes with internet companies. And that's the way I understand it. So
okay,
yeah, that's kind of the dealio there. So some people like these net neutrality regulations and others don't. As I said in the beginning, if you really don't care what I think about net neutrality, then cool. You can stop listening now, and I can feel good that you probably understand the situation a little bit better. But if you really want to know what I think about the whole debate, then stick around. We've got plenty of show left for you.
All right, man. Good podcast. See you later. No.
Yeah, all right. No, well, I know you don't care.
No,
you're the only one who can't leave.
Yeah. Before we get into it, that the whole no fast lanes thing, pro net neutrality people are framing it a little bit differently. They're saying that the cost of access must be the same for all sites. So a website that wants to access the internet, we have a domain, the best way to explain it.com. Give a little plug there. We pay to have that domain. Well, if you have a popular domain, you take up a lot of traffic, and those fast lanes, most likely would be very expensive. So maybe Netflix and Google could pay for those, but the smaller sites like our website, we couldn't. So our traffic would be slower than theirs because they could pay for it. And that's how they're framing it, is that the cost of access for little internet startups, which are popping up all over the place, would be they wouldn't get as much traffic, I believe. Or maybe it's vice versa. It would be more expensive for the little guy to compete,
Right. Yeah, and that is the way that's the way the pro net neutrality people usually frame it.
Okay.
So, but that's essentially correct in what they're saying, that certain companies could pay extra in order to have a faster connection, so that way the consumers that want to go to that website can get a better experience. So that's what that whole concept is.
Yeah.
Okay. So, cutting it off now, if you don't want to hear what I have to say, cool. But from now on, there will be lots of bias.
Let the games begin.
Alrighty. All right, so what do I think of net neutrality? Well, first thing, I think as a concept, I really don't have an issue with it. If ISPs feel as though net neutral policies and services are what's going to provide the most value to their customers, and then obviously by providing the most value, they're going to make the most money, then great, more power to them, right? So net neutrality as a concept, fine. I don't know. If it works, sure. So the issue I have is, where the heck did we get this idea that the almighty government has to be in control of the internet? Why on earth would anybody want the biggest corporation on the planet, the government, to have control of the internet? Think about it. These net neutrality regulations are in response to a fear that, quote-unquote, big corporations are going to control who can access what content. Well, okay, maybe that's a valid fear, maybe it's not. Time will tell. But the solution is to give all of the power to the biggest corporation on the planet, the one who doesn't have to provide us with any value in the first place to get our money, but can outright take it from us even if we're unsatisfied with the job they're doing, right? So that's the solution, apparently. But I don't know, just speaking for myself, that's kind of ludicrous to me, and it astounds me that anyone can think that this is a good idea. So, sorry, that
was a good quick rant. I'm excited for the next 4 pages that say the same thing.
Most of it's a little bit more measured. But.
Yeah, to jump in and full disclosure, I am in agreement, but I'm trying to play devil's advocate. Since we can elect officials to the government and we can't elect officials to these internet service providers, it gives a sense of security that we would know who's regulating the internet versus allowing those corporations to do it. Does that make sense? People want a foot in the door so that when or if corporations were to abuse their internet users, then they could crack down using legislation.
Right. And I'm going to tell you why that's not at all true. You have way more power over a corporation than you do over government, especially the FCC.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm just answering the
hypothetical. I got you.
Yeah, right. So, making ISPs common carriers means that the FCC has the authority to regulate these ISPs however they want, because, checks on government really don't work, right? We see that.
Yes.
So what makes this particularly dangerous is that the FCC is actually completely unelected. So no matter which side of the political aisle you might be on, that has to at least make you a little wary. So think about it. The FCC is an independent agency, which means that the president nominates and the Senate approves the board or the commission that makes the decisions. So that means that the president is essentially in control of the FCC, which everyone wants to be regulating the internet. So instead of competing ISPs that need to provide you value, determining what you can see. You'll get one man or woman who likely half the country didn't vote for deciding what you can see on the internet. And speaking just for myself, I'd much rather have an ISP determine what I can or can't see, because they have to at least make me happy in order to get me to part with my money.
Yes, they provide the value, and
Right.
and you provide their profits. So what about the issue of contracts though? So you typically sign a contract with whoever's providing your internet. So what if they start doing that and you're still locked into that contract? So they're still guaranteed money for a certain amount of years.
Well, okay, in that instance, if they're not holding up, that's just a simple contract violation.
Well, yeah.
They're not holding up their end of the bargain, in which case you definitely have a case there.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that that's a thing that should happen.
Yeah.
But if you agree with this, if you've agreed to pay your money and they've been upfront about everything, then okay. So I'm just about to get into that.
Yeah.
So, okay, so that was the first reason why I oppose net neutrality regulations. It's the first of 4 reasons that I've thought of, and there might be more, but who knows. So that kind of transitions me into the next reason, and that's just simple property rights, right? Look, guys, you don't have a right to use the internet, okay? So, even if the government classifies ISPs as common carriers, does not mean the concept of a public utility even makes sense. You don't have a right to have the internet provided for you. In fact, you only have a right to your life, your liberty, and your property, nothing else. So, if the internet was a right, then that means that you would have the right to force those ISPs to provide internet for you, even if you couldn't afford it, even if you couldn't make it worth their while. And sorry, that's called slavery, okay? That's not a good thing. Now, I'm not saying that that's what would happen. I'm just saying that that's what having a positive right to something means. It means that someone owes you a product or service merely for your existing. It's just not a coherent idea. If it was a coherent idea, then people's rights will have been violated by not having the internet for thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
They weren't getting their rights fulfilled by people by not having the internet. So okay, so that's the property rights issue. You just don't have a right to use the internet. So if somebody's offering you a product, you don't have the right to force them to make that product a certain way, right? So okay, at this point, I'm likely going to get some pushback from some people saying, hey, taxpayer money built the infrastructure that ISPs use, right? Well, that's not exactly true. So, the original infrastructure and research certainly was paid for by the taxpayers, but since then, ISPs have created and maintained their own, and they interconnect with the rest of the networks in order to provide you with the internet you enjoy. But even so, even if we did build it all, you don't have a right to the labor of those who work to maintain and provide you with internet in the same way that you don't have a right to the labor that farmers perform when they provide food to grocery stores, right? So for me, it's essentially just a property rights issue, and because property rights is, the foundation of the public ethics, then there's no real reason to argue it any further, right? So for me, this is my main reason for opposing net neutrality regulations, is because they violate property rights. But, some people do disagree with that there are such things as property rights. So I'm going to offer a few other reasons that might be a bit more convincing. Do you have anything else you want to add about that?
Nope. I'll have some stuff at the end to add on to what you're thinking. I'll look through what I've got written down, but you're building up a good case, in my opinion. Right. How maybe you touch on this down here, but how could this fit in with antitrust and monopoly laws? And maybe how do you feel about those laws as well?
Okay. Yep. Okay. So man, you're just killing these transitions, man. That's going to transition me into my next reason that maybe you guys might find more convincing than property rights. And I'm sorry if I'm getting animated. If you disagree with me, I don't hate you. It's just we disagree, and so it's okay to have nuance. And yay.
Hey, I like when people show emotion when they're debating, just not pounding their fist on the table, angrily threatening, which you aren't. You're explaining your ideas, which is cool.
Yeah. No, and yeah, like I said, if you disagree with me, I don't think you're stupid. I just think you're wrong. But like that's, I think that's just being honest.
Yeah.
Like I get the pro net neutrality side. I understand the arguments for it. I just think they're wrong. So first two reasons: one, I don't trust government more than corporations. Two, property rights. It's that corporation's product or service to offer you. You don't have a right to force them to make their product a certain way. And then the third reason is just, economics, So in order to understand kind of how economics applies to this situation, you need to understand what economics is. So economics is the allocation of scarce resources that have alternative uses. That's the definition of economics by Thomas Sowell in his book Basic Economics, which I highly recommend for anybody who wants to learn about economics.
Great book.
So, yes, it is. It's like 600 pages of goodness.
Sitting on my desk right behind my computer right now that I still have to get back to you.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously bandwidth and internet service is not an unlimited resource, right? There are things that need to be done, infrastructure that needs to be built, and so on, right? So these things don't just happen. The internet's not just a thing that is unlimited in its nature. And that's the thing I want to emphasize about government declaring something to be a public good. It doesn't solve the scarcity issue. Okay, so government declares water as a public good or a human right. Okay, great. Suppose that is true. Suppose it actually is a human right or it is a public good. Well, it doesn't solve the fact that there are things that need to be done in order for water to be drinkable and for it to be accessible by those who supposedly have a right to it. So the internet's going to run into the same problems. So regardless of if you think access to the internet is a right, you still need to solve the scarcity problem. And what I mean by the scarcity problem is that in any economic system, there is a system of rationing resources. So in socialism or communism, the government decides who gets what and how much of a resource someone gets. But in capitalism or the free market, prices are going to do this. They're going to do the rationing of resources. And here's the thing. People can't just charge whatever they want for prices in a free market because prices convey very important information. They signal entrepreneurs where people's wants are. It's just supply and demand. So when people want more of something, the price for that thing is going to go up. Because, well, individually, the reason for this is that people are ultimately looking out for themselves and they want to charge as much as possible for what they have to offer, right? That's just human nature. So when you're in business, your goal is to find something that people value and get them to pay you as much money as humanly possible for it. That's what business essentially is. But, okay, so that's what each individual does in the free market. But overall, in the market, the raise in prices is going to signal to other entrepreneurs that, hey, people really want this thing that is selling really well, so that might be a good thing for me to sell if I'm looking to make money. So when that happens, competition is going to emerge between providers of a good or service, and thus the price is going to go down in order to sell more to people, right? So the great thing about the price system is that it doesn't require an overseer to ration resources. It happens naturally using humanity's self-interest. So this is actually in contrast to government rationing. So there's really no rhyme or reason to government rationing. They have to somehow determine who gets how much of a given resource from a very removed position in the market. There's nobody, no matter how smart they are, that is qualified to do this. Like, nobody can know all of the information that's necessary to figure out where goods ought to go and who has the biggest need or desire for goods in our market, right? And, so nobody can know that information.
And when you do have the government putting its hand in the market to try and influence it, what you're really having is some sort of like a price ceiling or price floor, or they're just going to move the product inefficiently because they're no longer relying on prices and supply and demand to locate these resources. They're relying on someone's external like feelings, like maybe we should send all of our corn over to Maine and Maine's lobsters all the way over to Nebraska. Well, as much as I like lobster, I like corn too. Like, can I buy some corn and not have lobster? Like,
and it's either prices and therefore the individual determining how much you desire something, or it's the government doing it. Like, every economic system has the issue of this allocation of scarce resources, right? So it's not that prices are inherently cruel, it's just a system that does it. So maybe you hate the price system. Well, the alternative is government rationing, and I think it's got such fatal problems that I just talked about that, like Winston Churchill said, capitalism is the worst economic system of all time besides all the other ones that we've tried.
I love that quote.
So that's something I really wanted to emphasize about prices, that they're not just arbitrary things that people can charge. So the reason I talked about prices is that it's how goods and resources are rationed, and the internet is a scarce resource. There is a limited amount of internet, I guess. I don't know. Okay, limited amount of bandwidth and stuff that we use for the internet, right? So what I want to emphasize is that the government rations resources on a whim, and it inevitably is terribly inefficient, which leads to lower quality of life for everybody. Because, like I said, nobody can know the proper amount of information, which, the price system doesn't rely on. So let's apply this kind of price system to the internet. So government wants to be in charge of regulating who gets access to how much internet, right? Because that's part of what it means for them to be able to regulate ISPs. What they're saying with net neutrality is that, okay, the way we're going to allocate these scarce resources is not to allocate them, just everybody gets everything they need. So they're just kind of denying the scarcity problem. That's basically what net neutrality does. It's just like, no, the scarcity problem doesn't actually exist. But as we know, that's not true. So this government regulation of the internet service providers suffers from the same economic calculation problem and knowledge problem that all goods suffer from. So let's think about one of the concerns that many people have that leads to them supporting net neutrality. So the ability for ISPs to charge certain companies more for priority bandwidth, the fast lane concept, right? So if you remember, as we just talked about, this increase in prices that the ISPs are going to charge, it means something. It signals something to the market. So it means that these companies value this priority bandwidth more than another company. Because the internet's a scarce resource, this increase in prices is necessary in rationing who gets how much internet access, right? But this increase in prices is not a bad thing. It allows ISPs to afford to build more infrastructure to handle more traffic. So if they weren't allowed to charge more, then they couldn't afford to build the infrastructure. Okay, so the worry here, though, is the fear that ISPs don't have competition like other areas of the market. And I think this is what you were getting at with the monopoly, right?
Yes, yeah. And the natural monopolies, too.
Right, right. So that might be true now, but I think we need to look at some of the reasons why this might be the case. And I think we're going to see that ultimately government intervention into the market is the ultimate culprit. So a monopoly can only exist in the free market when someone provides the highest quality product for the cheapest price, right? That's the only way it can work in the free market, because otherwise someone else is going to figure out a way to do it better, and people naturally are going to switch where they buy their product or service to the other company. And if the monopoly is providing the highest quality product for the cheapest price, that's not a bad thing, right? We're getting the best. We should love those kinds of monopolies. But what happens, though, sometimes is that government creates artificial barriers to entry that allow ISPs to maintain these artificial monopolies. So they can not provide the highest quality product for the cheapest price and still be the only game in town, right? And so that's what allows these ISPs to charge these ridiculous prices that have been theorized, I guess. And it's because of government intervention in the market. And where we usually see this is in local governments. So what the local governments will do is they'll charge ridiculous prices for laying down the necessary infrastructure in order to start new ISPs. So what this does is it leads to an incredibly high barrier of entry for the new companies. So I don't say this all to say that these big corporations are totally blameless. Like, they certainly manipulate the government into giving them these monopolies, and I'm definitely against that, and I'd imagine you are too, right?
That's considered crony capitalism, and it's what gives capitalism a bad name is being able to purchase government, which is why I want government so small you can't even see it.
Yep.
So
almost like it. No, okay. All right. So right, and because corporations by themselves can't use force, right? They're not allowed to, right? So that's what gives government its power. So the free market's almost always going to provide people what they want the most if we allow it to work, because that's what it's designed to do. That's how you get rich in a free market. You provide value for someone else, right? So let's apply these free market principles to net neutrality. Well, first of all, what I want to say is another thing. I was looking up more of those local regulations. Like they charge an extra fee for like every pole you put up. Like, you see those telephone lines?
Yeah.
Like you have to pay a fee to put every single pole up to the city, and it's just stupid high costs that are totally unnecessary. That cause the barrier to entry to be so high, and that's how these people maintain their monopolies. So I just want to emphasize, monopolies that you might see are almost always caused by government, and the ones that aren't are good ones, because that's the best we're able to do it. So just with that out of the way, let's get to the net neutrality talk. So obviously there are people that are in favor of net neutrality. That I see it all the time on Twitter. That's something that they value in their ISP. So in a free market, there will be an ISP that pops up which will provide a net neutral experience because of all the value that they're going to provide. And because there are no artificial barriers to entry, other ISPs would need to provide a net neutral experience in order to compete with that ISP and get customers. So instead of advocating for net neutrality and regulations, everyone who supports net neutrality in principle ought to be supporting a free market with no government interference. That's how we get what we want.
Interesting.
All right?
I think that does assume that an ISP would do that. Whereas
if people are paying money for it, if they're willing to pay money for it,
if they're willing to pay money for a net neutral, yeah, heck yeah. But what if they're like, no one's going to offer it? Like, because they can choose to do that. They're a private company, and that's like, I'm fine with that. If they want to charge for, like, if I want to use Netflix, I've got to pay X amount a month to get that bandwidth or whatever, stuff like that.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that because there is a demand for a net neutral experience, an ISP will pop up in a free market with these, no artificial barriers to entry to meet that demand, because there will be money to be made there.
I would choose to use the word could pop up. You're saying it will pop up, which I understand, and that's completely reasonable. But like, saying it will pop up is it like it's guaranteeing that.
Well, okay, yeah, sure. I don't know.
I
don't know what would happen in the free market.
Sorry, I'm just like I'm a stickler for words like that.
Well, I would say it's likely because people are greedy, right? That's what's getting people all amped up, is that these greedy corporations are trying to extort us for our money. Well, if people really want to make the most amount of money, and the money is to be made in a net neutral market, then logically speaking, that's where ISPs would start going, right?
Yeah. And if true competition exists within that market, then you would have, like, corporations would try to be the most like net neutral if they are, like, that they deemed responsible for their company,
Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
something else I want to emphasize here is that, if you guys remember, I said mobile broadband providers aren't as affected strictly by these net neutrality regulations. And what you start to see is companies start to pay for these for the ability for users to access their websites, right? So an example of this is on Verizon. On Verizon, the NFL actually pays for my overage data when I watch NFL Mobile. So I could watch as much NFL Mobile as I want, and the NFL is like, well, we really want you watching the NFL, so we're just going to pay for this overage data. So chances are repealing net neutrality will cause prices to lower because more of these companies are going to take on, because they want you, interacting and using their websites and their services. So I would not be surprised, and I think we start seeing this in the mobile market because there's fewer regulations of companies starting to pay for you to access their websites. And so that's just me, theorizing about the free market, but I think there is some data to back that up.
I think that's true. I also think it could show, if net neutrality did exist in government form, it would increase prices because the government would be slowing down the big websites, essentially.
Yeah.
And then those big websites, in order to maintain what they've got going on, they're going to have to raise prices eventually. Right. I don't know how you logically get there. I've seen it mapped out before, but basically, Netflix or Google would have to pay more, and that's part of the reason I think that they actually support it, is because they can pay more.
Oh, you are so good.
I know.
You have just gotten me to my last reason. So, first reason, I don't trust government. Reason 2, property rights, man. Reason 3, economics. And then reason 4, I oppose net neutrality because of the sheer dishonesty of internet companies like Netflix and Google. Guys, do not be fooled by these guys. They say that they're all about this net neutrality for the user, right? Well, what they've done is they've hijacked the narrative and have used your fervor to push forward regulations that allows them to save money. Think about it. These companies save all sorts of money with these regulations. They don't like being charged extra money for the priority lane, so they pushed for net neutrality, and they've then since fearmongered the public into saving them money. Guys, they do not care about net neutrality. So even if you're a fervent supporter of net neutrality, don't fall victim to their manipulation of the public, right? They only support the regulation because it saves them money. And to be honest, it's actually kind of sickening to me to see them start this campaign for net neutrality when they really don't care about it. So that's my final reason. I don't like how dishonest they are. They're claiming to support net neutrality and they get the public on their side, but in reality, it's just to save them money. Okay, so even if you support net neutrality, these big corporations you're scared of are also supporting net neutrality. Netflix loves it because they don't have to pay money, and that's the only reason they're supporting it. So just be fair to both sides is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I completely agree. And it reminds me of 1984. They use words like doublethink and newspeak, but some people have combined those two together to create the word doublespeak. And basically, they're saying one thing, but they're really meaning another. They're obscuring their real ideology behind something that is not only relevant and new within government, but it's also popular, because I spend the majority of my day on a computer on the internet. So they start supporting things like this because in the end, it's going to better them and it reduces competition for them through government. So they don't have to do a thing. They just say, hey, yeah, we support this. And then the little guy gets damaged in that process.
Right, and that's what we always see happen with, regulation. So, and I guess there's one more thing I did want to mention. I forgot to in my economics argument is essentially I think net neutrality actually, the net neutrality regulations themselves actually do prevent new ISPs from popping up. Because think about it, if you were to start your own ISP, you'd probably it's probably cheaper to just contract with one company, say I will provide you internet just for you, right?
Yeah.
Nobody else can do it. Or I'll provide you with your connections, your infrastructure. But under net neutrality, you can't do that. So I think that's another way that net neutrality prevents ISPs from popping up to meet demand.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in conclusion, go for it.
Okay, well, as I was reading up on this, I was trying to get research so that I could have some actual points to bring up, and it wouldn't just be you ranting. I could also get in on the ranting part.
Sure.
And one piece that I found really interesting, it was on Forbes magazine, and I don't know the political bent of the person who wrote it, but it was just an op-ed on net neutrality, and it was he framed it as saying, "I'm the only techie against net neutrality." So here's the little quote that I wrote down. If I believed the U.S. government was omniscient, had only good intentions, and that these intentions would never change, I would be in favor of net neutrality and more. But it wasn't all that long ago that FDR was locking up citizens with Japanese ancestry and Woodrow Wilson was outlawing political dissent. And that stuck with me because obviously it's a confirmation bias thing. I'm very anti-government, but the idea that you're going to allow the government to control the internet, which has blossomed under the least amount of regulations of anything I've seen,
right?
It's become something incredible. And now you're saying, "Oh no, we got to hold back. We can't allow this to get too big."
Right.
I just find that intriguing, especially with the political turmoil in the years 2017.
Yeah. Dude, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah.
Although, if government were omniscient and, like, all good, that's basically God. So, if God wants to regulate the internet, you know what? I'm all for it. But I don't believe he does.
Yeah. Well,
and his name is not the U.S. of A.
We'll have to ask.
Yeah. Okay.
All right,
so that's the end of my rant. So just in conclusion and summary, number one, I don't trust the government to determine what I can see. 2, I don't have a right to the internet, and neither do you. 3, the economics of net neutrality they don't make sense. And then the 4th one is the internet companies supporting it have been completely dishonest in their hijacking of the narrative. So for those reasons, I can't get behind any regulation by the government. So again, I want to emphasize that, like, as a concept, net neutrality seems fine to me. I don't really have an issue with it. But guys, the market is the best way to achieve net neutrality. Okay? So with that said, I don't expect to have changed anyone's mind on the issue, and that really wasn't my intention. I just kind of wanted to say my piece, and y'all can think whatever you want. So it's free country.
You know what? If you disagree and you think you have a good argument, a good place to do that would be to send in a suggestion, and we could maybe read it off if we find it compelling.
Just send it to go to the contact page.
Yeah.
That might be better. And just send an email.
One of our emails. Yeah. Brecken at thebestwaytoexplainit.com. That's BRECKAN. And then Scott, which is easier to spell, SCOTT.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. We'd love to hear respectful arguments from you.
Yeah.
I don't want to see any flaming. Like, that would be not a thing that I would be okay with.
Like vitriolic?
Yes, vitriolic. Keep the vitriol down. And I guess there is one more thing I want to say. Y'all really need to chill about this net neutrality thing. If it gets repealed, it really won't be the end of the world. I promise. We need to stop making everything, a level 1000 on the end of the world scale, okay? So just relax. We'll be fine. We're going to get through this. Even if I'm completely wrong about net neutrality, it's not going to be that bad, okay?
Yeah.
So just let's take a step back, have some nuance on the issue, understand that there are arguments against and for net neutrality, and both sides deserve to be heard. And with that said, I am done talking about the internet probably for a while.
Yeah. I'm good with you not talking about it for like a year.
Next time I see you. That's all we're doing. All right.
Truth.
Okay. So just want to remind you that giveaway, send in a review. Maybe if you disagree with me, maybe wait a few days before you do it, and then review it. Just screenshot it, send it to me at Scott at thebestwaytoexplainit, and you guys can get entered to win the Amazon Echo. Dude, is there anything else you want to say?
I've got nothing, man.
All right, guys, you are awesome, and I guess we'll talk to you next time.
You're learning.